There are 5 things that software vendors don't want you to know. Yeah, I'm going to share those with you here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent and tech agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach their third stage of digital transformation success. And when we're working with clients to help them through their ERP projects, one of the big things we notice is that there are a lot of myths and a lot of common misunderstandings of what it takes to be successful in a project, what it takes to choose the right software, and ultimately how you're going to make your project successful. However, a lot of the myths are perpetuated by the fact that they serve the self-interest of the software vendors, but they don't necessarily help you. So what I want to do today is debunk those myths and share with you the counterpoints and the objective viewpoints of what you actually need to know to make your project more successful. Now, if you'd like to learn more about successful ERP projects and what it takes to be successful, be sure to read our book called Lessons from 1,000 Digital Transformations in ERP Projects. You can read that for free by scanning the QR code right here or go to the links below. Let's start with the idea of best practices. This is probably the myth that drives me the most crazy and bothers me the most about the industry. It's a certain level of arrogance and presumptuous behavior that really bothers me, in that software vendors will say, because we built the software a certain way, it is therefore best practice. And that just couldn't be any further from the truth. Now, for some organizations, some of the functions in a system might be best practice. It might be something that works best for you. But I think the way to look at software best practices are those are not best practices. Those are the ways that the software vendor decided to build their software. Now, sure, they might have built it based on what they think the market needs or what a lot of customers need, but one size doesn't fit all. The ERP vendors can't be everything to everyone, and there's no possible way that one software vendor is going to have any sort of best practices. So instead of thinking of software best practices, ask yourself, is this best practice for us? In some cases, the answer will be yes. And in some cases, for some vendors, the answer might be no. And so that's the important thing. And another presumptuous and arrogant thing I think software vendors are notorious for is that if you decide that best practice in the way the software is built doesn't work for you, they'll blame you and say you're the problem and you refuse to change because you won't accept the way the software is built. That might be true in some cases. We've certainly seen clients that have resisted change, and they could have just lived with what the software vendor has. But in most cases, the concerns are valid. The software doesn't work the way a customer needs it to. The customer has a certain set of business processes and unique competitive advantages that they want to preserve. Software vendor can't provide it, so that's okay. It might be that that software vendor is still okay for you, but you're going to have to figure out, do you customize that software and change their alleged best practices? Or do you go find a third-party system that really does provide best practices for you? There's a lot of different options you have, but the key here is not to assume that just because a software vendor says it's best practice doesn't mean that it is. In the world of software vendors, their job is obviously to design and build and deploy technology. That's their job. That's what you're hiring them for. So it's understandable that they would focus almost too myopically on technology because that's their job, that's the world, and that's what they know. However, that doesn't mean implementations are largely about technology. Too often, these digital transformations turn into a technical rabbit hole where we just focus on what the technology can and can't do, and we get so tangled up in the technology that we forget about the stuff that really matters, which is your business processes, your process improvements, the way you're going to organize the team, the way you're going to manage change, the way you're going to integrate that core technology to other systems, the way you're going to manage your data. There's all these different things that are far more important than the technology itself. But yet when you talk to a software vendor, they typically talk as though implementations are about technologies. Their proposals are about the technologies. The resources they provide are about technology. They're obviously selling you technology, which is understandable. But that is just one tiny piece of the equation. It's all the other stuff that's outside the purview and the scope of what a software vendor does and is good at that's going to make or break your project. So it's important to think of these projects not as technical implementations, but as business transformations that just happen to have one small piece of technology associated with them. Software vendors will have you believe that the design and build of software is the most important part of the project. Maybe some will decide or tell you that the testing is the most important part, or that the go live training is the most important part, or the go live itself is the most important part. But regardless of what recommendation or what stage they seem to think is the most important, the fact of the matter is the most important phase of the project is the one phase that most software vendors don't focus on and they don't even mention, and that is phase zero. Phase zero is really the pre-implementation planning before the software vendor ever gets involved in the project. It's before you even buy the software, ideally. You may have decided on what the software is going to be and which one you're going to buy, but you don't need to buy it on day one, even though they'll try to pressure you to do so. Phase zero is really important because that's where you define your business blueprint. It's where you define your program management and governance. It's where you do your change assessment, define your change management strategy. It's where you assess your data and put together a data migration strategy. It's where you define your architecture, the integration, the decommissioning strategy for your legacy systems. All that stuff should be done at phase zero so that by the time you get to the end of phase zero, you have a realistic timeline and budget, and you have realistic control and ownership of the project so that now you can actually go bring the technical consultants in. Now, the reason software vendors don't want you to know this is because I've created a problem for them by telling you that phase zero is the most important phase. By telling you that phase zero is the most important phase, I have now put their revenue at risk, or at the very least, I've deferred their revenue till further down the line, and they are sales reps driven by commission. They need to close the deal now, and they need to get the software sold now, and they need to get their technical resources staffed now. That runs completely counter to what you should be doing and what we see as the most successful companies doing, which is focusing on phase zero, getting everything planned out, taking the time to get it right so that by the time you start implementing with the technical implementer, you're managing them, you're being a lot more efficient and effective with how you use their time and resources, which again, they don't want you to do that necessarily because that means less money for them. And those are the things that are ultimately going to make your project successful is phase zero, yet most software vendors aren't going to tell you that. I have a challenge for you. If you're working with your software vendor on an implementation right now, ask them what their change strategy is for your project. Chances are very high, and I can almost bet you they're going to say their change management strategy is, of course, complete because they have included end user training in their plan. They've provided user adoption tools to help people learn the software. They've provided documentation. They've got a robust train the trainer program they're going to roll out. That is all one small piece of change management, but that is not change management. Change management starts well before the technical implementer gets involved. Change management should start early on during phase zero when you're defining what your organization is going to look like when it grows up, when you define what the job impacts are going to be, how you want to structure the organization going forward. That's when change management starts. It continues into communication and doing change impact assessments and change impact discussions with the affected work groups. It continues into the more detailed organizational design. Maybe you have to work with labor unions or labor boards to facilitate some of the changes that you want to see happen with your job roles and responsibilities. That is change management. Change management typically ends with training, but that is just the capstone. That's the end, and it should almost be not an afterthought, but something that doesn't create a lot of chaos and confusion, which more often than not it does, because for most organizations, they don't start change management until they get to training. And if you don't start change management until you get to training, what happens is people will freak out during the training when they realize how much their world is about to be disrupted and how much it's going to change. So be sure you focus on change management early on and resist that temptation to assume that the software vendor is going to do the change management for you when they do some light end user training toward the end of the project. I mentioned before that software best practices are a lie. And even if a vendor doesn't propose software best practices to you, they'll probably try to convince you that their software has pre-configured processes or predefined workflows that will help you run your business so that, again, you don't need to worry about phase zero, right? You don't need to worry about defining your future state because the software will tell you how to run your business. Now, this is true at the very detailed transactional level, but it is not true at the more macro and at the mid-level of your overall process architecture. The reason for this is because today's modern ERP systems are so flexible and so robust and can do so many different things, even without customization, that it's not enough to say we're just going to use the software out of the box and we're going to defer to how the software works to tell us how to run our business. Because what happens then is you quickly realize that the software doesn't have all the answers. The software, in fact, gives you more options, potentially more options than you know what to do with, and you're going to have to choose how you want the software to work. One interesting statistic to share with you is that there was a study done by a group called the Standish Group, and they studied over 100,000 different ERP implementations over 30 years. And they found that the number one cause of implementation delays on projects was something they called decision latency. And decision latency is essentially the inability to make fast decisions. And so what happens is you talk to your software vendor and say, hey, just go deploy this procure to pay business process using your best practices or your pre-configured software. And the vendor will have a million questions for you about how they should configure that one workflow. And in that process, you end up spinning your wheels trying to make decisions. And while you're trying to make decisions, by the way, the meter is running, the clock is running on the project, and you're adding time and cost to your project while you're trying to decide what you want your processes to be. So the software is not going to answer the question of how to run your business. It's going to give you some tools to run your business. It's going to give you some options, but ultimately you need to know going into the project what it is you want your general business processes from end to finish to look like, what pain points you want to address, what improvements you know you want to make. And of course, the technology is going to provide the tools to do it, but you need to have that stuff defined up front. And that is why, again, phase zero is so important. And it's important you decide as many of those things early on in the project rather than waiting until you're midstream. So these are the 5 myths that need to be debunked and you need to understand in order to be successful. But I'd love to hear from you. What other myths do you hear? What other misinformation do you receive from vendors or others in the ERP community or the digital transformation community? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Be sure to drop those in the comments below. And if you'd like to learn more about what makes a successful project versus a failed project, be sure to read our Lessons from 1000 Digital Transformations guide. You can find that by scanning the QR code right here, or you can go to the links below. So I hope you found this information useful and hope you have a great day.